Sometimes in portrait retouching, you may encounter a situation where you have to remove an object that the subject is wearing, like jewelry. Well, how do you do something like that? Like with this image, let's say that we want to remove this bracelet here. In order to do that, we're going to create two layers. We'll do the same exact thing on both layers. We'll just work on different sides of the image. And what we'll do is work with cloning, free transform, and warp. Let me show you how this works. Well, it begins by creating a new layer. So I'll click on the new layer icon. And I'll go ahead and double click this layer name, and I'll call this Cleanup-1. Next, select the Clone Stamp tool in the Tools panel. Up here in the Options bar, let's choose a brush without any hardness and a pretty big brush. I think we want to use one that's pretty big there, something like that. Now for the opacity, I'll bring this all the way up to 100%, aligned, turned on, and sample all layers. Next step, we'll go down here and hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt on Windows. And we're going to click on a good source area of the skin, maybe something like right about there. Then reposition this up over the bracelet and just start clicking. And as we click, what we can do is we can bring up this good source area into this part of the image. The problem, of course, that we're running into, as you can see here, is that we have good retouching, but the alignment is off, right? If we zoom in, all of a sudden, the wrist just looks very unnatural. How do we fix that? Well, to fix that, we need to take our two final steps. That is to use Free Transform and Warp. Let me show you how this works. If you go to the Edit pull-down menu, you can then select Free Transform right there. So Edit and Free Transform. This opens up our Free Transform overlay graphic. And here we have some important icons or little tools that we can use. What you can do is click on the center point, and you can drag this down to the point where your retouching began, which is down below. Now when you position your cursor near one of the corner points, it's going to rotate around that point. That's exactly what we want. So we'll go ahead and click and drag to bring this back up so that it's connecting to the top of the wrist there. Then next, we'll press Enter or Return to apply that. Now, it did a decent job as far as connecting it, but if you look closely, it's sort of bending out rather than in. So we need to take our final step, which will be to go to Edit and Free Transform. We're reactivating that one more time, and this time in the Options bar, we will click on this icon, which allows us to go into a warp mode. Click here, and you'll now see a grid on top of the area that you're working on. What you can do with this grid is you can click and drag this. And you can see how I can bend this around. What I'm going to do is just click and drag this so I have a little bit of a arch there. We can also click on these points here, or just right on the grid itself to customize that. Then press Enter or Return. Now, without a ton of effort, we literally have perfect retouching, at least on one side of the image. There's a little bit of the bracelet still showing up, so I'll grab the Clone Stamp tool, tap the left bracket key to make my brush a little bit smaller, and just clone that away there. All right, well, that's the left side. Let's work on the right side. We'll create a new layer, and I'll call this new layer Cleanup-2. Next, we'll choose the Clone Stamp tool, just like before. Same settings here. Let's use a little bit of a bigger brush. Tap the right bracket key to make your brush bigger. Option or Alt click a good source area, and then bring that over. And I'm clicking multiple times here so that I'm just kind of chipping away at this. And I also want to work on the area that's on the skin there. And just bring this in. If it isn't lined up, I'm not worried about that. We can see that it definitely isn't right there. Do you remember what we do next? There are two steps. First step is to go to Edit and choose Free Transform. Here, we're going to change the registration points to right where our retouching started so that we can rotate or pivot around that. We'll move that a little bit. And now that we know that we're going to need to take the final step, while we're still here, let's click on the icon for Warp. When we click on that, we now have the ability to warp this. It's going to look a little bit jagged here. That's just because we're in this preview. That's okay. So we'll click and move that around so we have a nice fluid line right there. Then click on the check mark or just press Enter or Return to apply that. Now, sometimes what may happen after you've done this is you may see the skin needs a little bit of work. So what I tend to do is create one more layer, and this one we'll call Cleanup-3 if I notice any issues. So here I'll grab the Clone Stamp tool, and I'll drop my opacity down really low to around 10 or 15%. And what this allows you to do is just to go over any little areas where you may notice that you kind of created a repeating pattern in the skin, or the skin was a little bit too dark up there. And so I'm just changing the shading a little bit by Option or Alt clicking and painting in some clone stamp work just at really low opacity. Now, this particular retouch that we've just done here is incredibly difficult to do without knowing this technique. But with the technique that we have here, all of a sudden it unleashes this power of Photoshop that maybe we didn't even realize was there. And let's review that, because this is a valuable technique to have in your bag of tricks. The first step was just kind of working on one side of it. We did the clone stamp tool, free transform, and warp. Then we did the other side. And then last but not least, if we needed any finishing touches, we did a little bit of clone stamp work with just a low opacity, so we have nice smooth blending. And so here is our final before and then after.